Hi, everyone. Welcome to the AI and Banking Summit. I'm excited for our next session with Peter Wannemacher. Peter is a senior analyst at Forrester Research, specializing in digital strategy for retail banks. He works with executives at the banking providers and their partners to help them win, engage, and retain customers. Peter leads Forrester's ongoing research in digital banking, accessing online digital banking initiatives, and digital sales efforts. Peter, how are you doing, sir?
Pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. In this session, our bots ready to be bankers, and I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about yourself and your story.
Sure. So I'm at Forrester now. I've been here for a while. My background prior to that was academic. I sort of came out of a post-grad statistics focus, came to Forrester as a statistician, a sort of proto data scientist. Fell backwards, I won't use obscenities, fell backwards into financial services data and worked with our great group of folks that were analysts, folks like Kathy Graber, Brad Strothkamp, Bill Doyle, working with them to help make sure they could support, or in some cases not support, their arguments for banking executives with data. I then evolved probably 6 years ago. I switched roles and have been an analyst ever since.
That's great. So I'd love to hear this. So you wrote a Forrester report called Bots Are Not Ready to Be Bankers. Can you just elaborate a little bit on the conclusions that you had in that report?
Sure. So the report was about a year ago, and which in AI time matters a lot, right? And what the reason it came about was this. A lot of our bank executives, as well as some of their partners, folks like ad agencies, vendors, traditional vendors, as well as bot vendors, were coming to us and saying, we need to build a bot. That was what was often happening. It actually, it felt a lot like 2007, 2008, even in 2009, where banks would come to us, to Forrester, and simply say, we need to build an app. And we would say, what are you trying to achieve with that app? And too often the answer was, we need to build an app. And so, and yet, I tend to spend a lot of my time doing research in technology, of course. More recently, that involves a lot of research into AI. And so I've been lucky enough to work with Google and IBM and a lot of the other folks and look at what they're doing in AI, as well as some startups that are doing really cool things. And so I am bullish about the long-term sophistication and the long-term value of AI. So this question comes up, which is, great, so people want to build bots. My bank executives want to put money in this. I won't say throw, spend money on this. And we know that the evolution of AI has been rapid. What's the answer? What should they do and what shouldn't they do? And the answer is, when we did our research, we found that there were a number of factors that were positive, but also a number of factors that were negative. And when I say negative, I mean potentially problematic for the bank, for the bank's customers, and ultimately for the success of both the initiative and the bank's business outcomes more broadly. And I won't go into all of them. Feel free to come and read the research at Forrester.com if you want. But if you don't want to, I'll distill it down this way. Bot experiences are uneven today. Or at least that's what was true a year ago. I'm happy to talk in a few minutes about where they are now. But at the time, bot experiences, I mean industry agnostic, across industries, across task flows, across user scenarios and journeys, bot experiences were uneven. In our research, we found that about 70% of the time they were effective and successful, meaning the customer is able to complete their objectives and do so conveniently. 70% is a great percentage, right? It's awesome. And for firms like H&M and Taco Bell, that's a great percentage. That's a useful way of using technology to improve customers' experiences and do it at a reduced cost per interaction. The problem is 30% is really high for banks. And add to that, or that is intertwined with the fact that people's money is an especially sensitive subject. And so what we tended to say was, if you're using Taco Bell's Taco Bot on Slack, which is a great bot, by the way, if the conversation with the bot goes a little, flimsy, and you end up ordering 6 extra tacos, well, that might be kind of annoying. You might have to pay a couple extra bucks, but it's a free tacos, or maybe not free, but at least tacos. In contrast, if you have no way of understanding how much money you have in your account, or if you move money accidentally multiple times when you need to move it only once because of a bot, either a broken bot or a misunderstood bot or a misunderstood human, the stakes there can either be really high in reality, or even if you put aside the real consequences, the perceived risk, the perceived consequences from the standpoint of the customer can be really high. And I'll quickly end this part of it by saying, so this got a lot of press, some good, some bad, or I got a lot of good press, but then a lot of bad reaction, which I'm happy to talk about. One journalist had their headline, and I think it's better than our research, or sorry, not better than our research, I hope, but better than our writing. Their headline was this: financial services aren't tacos. And I thought, that's exactly right. That's what it comes down to. And so our advice, and here we get to, I guess I lied. There's one last comment I'll make here, which is banks have, no matter how big the bank is, they do not have unlimited resources and money to spend. And so when it came to what should you put money into today, the answer was not nothing having anything to do with bots. The answer for most banks, not all, but for most banks, was you do not want to use your money trying to roll out a general purpose bot that will give your customers uneven experiences, even if it's good most of the time, uneven ones. And instead you could use that money to invest in those back end, those foundational digital services and initiatives that will enable you to have the best bot in the world a year from now at the time, 2 years, 3 years. And we'll talk about where that horizon line, it differs by bank. But that was the thesis. I know it was a long, but that was the thesis.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we took a look at the report and tried to distill some of the information from that, I immediately, as an individual that's building a business based on artificial intelligence and creating these types of virtual assistants for banks, I kind of took a step back and said, how do you build data assets within a bank that can help them in these initiatives if you're not putting effort into the technology? And I think you're absolutely right. The concept of a foundational, I guess the way to put this would be, how do you build a foundational data bank, a data layer that anything can start to connect in? It doesn't matter whether it's a bot or an app or a website. How do you lower the time and the effort that takes, the innovation cycles to be able to pump these technologies out? And I really find that it's interesting that that's where you go with it, because I mean, to be honest with you, when we work with banks, the biggest initiative that they're always under is the consolidation of the data layer, trying to understand how to maintain governance and access to this data in a clear and concise way. And so I totally agree with your concept of, take a step back, build the foundation, and then start to increase the rapid pace of innovation. But I will just say there that it's, AI as an initiative, it's about building data assets, and the ability to create those data assets. If you don't do that in the future, it could set you back even longer than you think about, but that doesn't mean that you can't ignore the fundamental issues that every bank deals with, which is the data layer. So I love that concept that you guys were tying into.
And I will say, going back to the analogy of apps when they first arrived, or when the iPhone was first launched, and that was a big deal. Ultimately, a lot of the banks, of course, built apps. Our objection was never, stop, don't ever build that app. The question was, do so thoughtfully, purposefully, and make sure you have the back end that can make it so it is a great experience for customers. Yeah. And I'll say this very quickly related to the bots question. I've actually worked with many banks since that report where we have helped them build a bot. It gets into also so there's really two questions. What does the bot do? And who does it do it with and for? Mm-hmm. So what I still worry about is this idea of the bot as teller, which we may well get to. I'm not worried about it long term. In the near term, this idea that the bot is this sort of generalist for all your banking needs, even the firms that have done it pretty well, DBS, USAA, Ally, even those banks, it still is uneven. And so if you're going to be half as good as USAA's bot, that's not going to be good enough. And so instead, we actually urge banks, and a lot of banks have started to do this, is build out bots. I don't have a great catchy term for it. Maybe you can come up with one. But bots that are focused on specific needs and purposes. So you're building out those data assets, which is, as you already said, the most important aspect of it. And governance, I'm glad you said data governance, because it's one that we often feel. At no bank is it fully lacking, but often there's a maturity level that needs to, there is a maturity level that's too low. And so we see the leading firms, the ones that are ready to roll out a bot, either a focused bot or a generalist bot, are usually well ahead on the maturity curve. But what we've found is that a lot of them are starting to build these bots for specific needs and purposes. So an example that I like that we've started to see a couple play with, none that have gone live mainstream yet, but debt. So a lot of people have debt, as is reported in the news all the time, especially young people who are often digitally savvy, but especially digitally comfortable. They're very willing to experiment with a new UI, a new touch point, whatever it may be. And humans of all ages don't like talking about debt with other humans. Yeah. Even humans they know, that's right. Even humans they don't know, excuse me. So talking to Barbara in Kansas City or in any other, farther flung country is something that causes anxiety, and you can actually see in banks' own data that people try to avoid it, doing other things. They use self-service, or they do a lot of things they're trying to avoid. A bot might be a really great fix for that, because the anonymity of the bot, the non-humanness of the bot is valuable. And not all debt questions are straightforward, but debt is a very specific part of your financial life. And a good bot, right, a bot with great quote unquote brains behind it, right, where the data assets are there, I see that as one that I'm really excited to see, and not just the debt one, that's one example, but starting to see those examples. I mean, I'm really excited to write, which we're planning on doing, some examples of bots that are working really well. All those concerns and all that danger of just saying we need a bot, let's roll a bot out so that we can have press around it, that still worries me. But I'm excited to see this evolve, and that evolution I'm very bullish on.
Yeah. So outside of the data access, governance, and everything that surrounds the concept of data, what are the big blockers that banks are running into building these types of technologies outside of the standard ones that every bank is going to? For the bank that has not yet explored these technologies, what are they going to run into that they should be looking out for?
So your question is a good one. I will say the big ones are the ones they should be, right? The data one is the big one. There's other things like integration with core systems. This is one that non-bank industries have to deal with, right? Everyone has core technology and often legacy systems. Banks tend to have two things. One, banks tend to have more of them, and they're often primary, or I'll put it this way, they're necessary to any bank initiative that's outside of a pilot or a user lab testing. And number two, they have regulatory pressures that make integration with back-end systems more complicated. The risks are higher for them, and in some cases the compliance. So, I think that's it. This does get into, though, I mean, the phrase start small is perhaps overused, but it may be overused, but it's not untrue. And that's why, a lot of the leading banks that you even now know have bots out there started small, where they could control a little more of the regulatory questions. They could control, they were plugging into 3 core systems or three legacy systems, not 1,400 or 400 or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So that's I think the big ones that they're going to run into. The last thing I'll say is this, which is just won't surprise anyone, but maybe they don't think about, which is internal politics, I'll say. So banks tend to still be organized. They've done great work in the past few years of moving away from silos. There's no bank that doesn't have some part of it that has a cross-functional team, uses Agile, et cetera. No big bank, I should say. And yet big parts of them are. And so lines of business will be, there'll be clashes. right? What does this bot do is also a question of who owns it.
Yeah.
And so I think that'll be a question that's already a question we're hearing bank executives start to ask and sometimes answer and sometimes not be able to answer.
Yeah, we often at Abe, we think of the way that a consumer looks at the bank, it's consumer bank. And then the way that the bank looks at the consumer, which is 88 different banks looking at the consumer. And trying to own one initiative across a couple silos is an amazing initiative. But to think that you can create one kind of generalist touch point from consumer to bank across all 88 silos, it's just, it's going to have to be a serious initiative for the institutions. And I kind of equate it to the way that they huddled together and created apps. You know, it's such an interesting parallel between the way that apps developed and the way that the data layers around apps developed. And many people say that there's not too much difference in the way that apps consume data, the way that the bots should consume data. And I don't necessarily disagree with that concept.
No, there will eventually. I mean, right? But no, in broad strokes, that's absolutely true.
Yeah. So
yeah, and by the way, let me say, just like with apps, it will not be a sufficient answer to your customer to say, oh, well, that's not my line of business. And I mean that obviously in a literal sense, right? You can't say that when they call you on the phone, but I also mean in terms of designing the experiences, sort of saying, well, that's not my problem, won't work. And you see the leading companies, Discover and USAA and CaixaBank in Europe, M-Bank in Poland, Commonwealth Bank of Australia, all the Australian banks, CIBC in Canada, that answer is increasingly unacceptable, and that's a good thing.
So we've talked about some of the big banks and some of the upper tier institutions, but how do you think that the small and medium banks should be differentiating their AI strategies from these larger institutions? You know, these things aren't necessarily commodities yet. So how is it open source that they should be taking advantage of and trying to maybe create some of these things in their own internal innovation teams, or should they be trying to think about it the same way that the larger institutions are, where it's kind of a core competency of the business? I always equate it, but please include this in your answer. It's like the app wave again, you know, drawing that parallel. The larger institutions they led the wave of apps and they were wildly successful adopting customers with that. And then the other institutions kind of caught up to that movement. Can you kind of parallel to that for me?
Yeah. So let me start by saying that there are going to be differences in strategy, execution, investment, a whole number of things. I do not believe there will be major differences in how AI affects their business, which isn't always true. In this case, in this case, AI is going to change the way bank customers do things, and it's going to change the way banks do things, and that's going to be as true for the small banks as it will for the big banks. And frankly, let me say, the threat of not acting either quickly enough or more often appropriately is just as, serious for a small bank, a medium-sized, and a big bank. It'll differ in how quickly it might happen, but it won't change and it won't differ in the degree of impact. In terms of how they should, so I do believe, I think we read this in the report, going back to the Bots Aren't Ready to Be Bankers report. It is very unlikely that a bank, any bank of any size, will be the organization that develops the breakthrough AI system that changes everything. And so the partnership component of this, right? Colleague of mine has a great little, very basic story of the evolution of really innovation. And, there's the old school sort of secretive labs that no one knows about where they're doing R&D and there were some companies that did great work with that. Then they moved into sort of shops that everyone knew about, but no one was really exposed to. And then it got a little more open, and then it became fully about partnerships, right? FinTech partnerships, maybe too often said at conferences and stuff, but there's a reason for it. FinTechs belong in banks' ecosystems. So I do think that, yeah, open source and partnerships are the way to go for small and medium size. I actually think big ones need to be careful. I think many of the big ones would actually be wise to partner with, and we see this, right, with the Googles, the IBMs, most obviously. I will say there are some times where you need to pick. So Macquarie Bank in Australia, this is published, so I don't mind revealing this. They, in their retail efforts, decided that they need to sort of really carefully choose 2, 3, maybe at most 4 areas where it made the most sense for them to build their own IP, their own technology, rather than go out and do what someone else is doing well. They openly admit, their CIO said a quote, something like, I'm not getting this exactly right, but something like, we're more than happy to use what other people do well. Almost all the time. Some of the time, though, we want to build it ourselves, and not just there's this old problem of them sort of for internal political reasons, they want to build it themselves. I think Macquarie Bank is a little smarter. They're saying, we're going to identify those places where there's enough value in having our own IP. And so for them, there's interesting. So some are unsurprising. Marketing, for example, is one. Search, they decided to build their own. But machine learning was the third one. And that's interesting. Now, machine learning in Forrester's research, in our sort of taxonomy, is a subcategory of AI or a subset of AI-enabled technologies or AI type of technologies. But that's interesting. They wanted to build their own machine learning. I think they built a machine learning algorithm that was essential, in their view, to their business. Now, it'll be years before we know whether that was the exact right move, but I think that banks of all sizes need to be careful about what they're choosing. The smaller banks will have fewer areas that they build themselves. The bigger banks will have more, but I think for all of them, there's a pretty similar approach. It's just a matter of how many or how much money, to be more accurate.
Yeah, I was on a panel in New York at a lending conference, and one of the questions that came from the audience was, as a bank, how do you even begin to acquire the talent that it takes to create these not so rudimentary machine learning algorithms? And as a statistician, I'm sure you can identify very well with the difference between the rudimentary algorithms that you get off the shelf and off GitHub, and then where an artist can come in and start painting with math and applied mathematics. Can you just speak to how banks should consider and maybe what they should be doing different from a culture perspective and a recruitment perspective to get this?
Sure, I'll say it in 2 ways. One goes back to the answer I gave last time, which is partnerships. There are brilliant fintech that are good at hoovering up brilliant talent, and go work with them, right? Especially for the small and medium-sized banks, that's a great idea. The big ones, I'm just going to steal someone else's advice because it's good advice. So I was out to dinner with a bank executive, and he was saying, look, for the past 5 years, we have been trying to get the best development talent, best really engineering, developers, et cetera, the best talent out of the best universities, and we are willing to pay top dollar. We're willing to throw lots of beanbag chairs and bowling alleys and free lunches at the problem. And while we're not going to stop doing some of that, we recognize something within the past year. We won't win that war. So instead, what we need to be willing to do is hire good and train to great. Just like I said a few minutes ago, I think it'll be years before this particular bank, which did not give me permission to use it, so I won't say who it was, before that proves whether that's right or wrong. But I think to some degree, I think it's the only option left to some of those banks. So you can hire a lot of great. I don't mean that there's, give up on going out to Silicon Valley and talking to those folks, but there needs to be a recognition that, and we all know this, right? I mean, to be cheesy about, to use a sports analogy, the top 5 draft picks are often not the best 5 players years down the road. Mm-hmm. That's especially true in some sports like baseball and football, which I think are probably a slightly better analogy, even though none of it's perfect. So what that happens is it's better systems. In this case, I mean systems, processes, right? Not technology systems, but the culture in place, the systems in place, right? I'm a Patriots fan, so I think they do a really good job. But, and that makes a big difference. There is the culture stuff, and I don't pretend to be an expert in corporate culture. Forrester has a few of them. I'm not one of them. What I will say is this, the banks that I see that have the best talent and the best training of talent tend to have a culture where there's an acknowledgement that what they're doing isn't especially sexy, but what they're trying to do is really bold, right? I know a bank that their goal is to be the #1 mobile bank in the world. That may not excite every 17-year-old or 22-year-old coming out of college, but that's a fun project to be on. That's a fun goal to have. That won't change everything. You can't just say that, right? You can't say we're going to try to be the best mobile bank in the world. Now we'll spend no money on it. But I think that's what we're seeing be successful. And the last thing I'll say here is organization matters. Again, I'm not the expert on org structures, but firms like Vanguard, USAA, companies that are not brand new chickens, right, or whatever you call it. They're not new banking or financial services companies. They have switched. Their orgs are built around customer journeys, and they're not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk. Their P&L is often built around the customer. Forrester wrote a report years ago called One Customer, One P&L. The idea was not that any company would ever actually get there, but that should be the goal. You should be trying to get as close to that as possible. And I think that doesn't immediately change the culture, but it starts to juice those processes and people and starts to get them there.
Yeah, I think some of the banks really underestimate the assets that they really have in this scenario. I mean, from my experience with these individuals that are highly talented in advanced machine learning and particularly deep learning, the technology that they create requires enormous amounts of data. And you can't just have. Most startups don't start with a load of data. And, as a data scientist, you want to go optimize how quickly your Uber gets to your front door, or would you rather help a person understand how to manage their debt better in relation to the rest of the world?
No, you're absolutely right. And I always say this. I mean, banks get maligned a lot, sometimes with good reason. But they have always been pretty darn good at collecting data, and they're pretty good at storing and managing data. Mm-hmm. I mean, and this is one piece of evidence of this, not conclusive, but one piece of evidence is trust in banks remains pretty high. People don't love banks. It's a little bit like Congress. They tend to dislike banking, but they kind of like their bank. And as a data point of this, in the US, bank customers trust their bank more today than they did before the Great Recession. That's not all about data, but it's tied up. It's part of that experience, or part of that relationship, I should say. So that, I think you're absolutely right. And those data assets are enormous. And they're starting to get better. And we saw a big bank that spent 4.5 years, again, thinking about a sort of foundational initiative, 4.5 years, completely rebuilding their data infrastructure so that they could enable things that they could never think of doing today, right? Real-time predictive analytics, real-time transactions for customers, and all of that. If that is the base layer of what's great AI, and then potentially a great bot experience on top of all that, mm-hmm. That's awesome. That's why I'm bullish about this. So yeah.
All right, Peter. So wrapping up here, it's halfway through 2017. What do you think are going to be the big emerging fintech trends for 2018?
So I was at an innovation day and a partnership with FinTech Day, and people were asking this sort of thing. And I'll say this: FinTech has done a good job. FinTech, go to Finovate. It's at least fun, right? And they've done a good job also of covering a fair amount of ground, right? Yes, there are some, that payments that think about the last inch, what I call the last inch, right? Payment startups that all they really do is think about the very last part of that payment. They don't think about the infrastructure, the rails, or anything like that. Those got overhyped for a while. Likewise, onboarding for a while. Everyone thought they could solve onboarding. So there's some hype cycle element to it. But I think that broadly, fintech does a pretty good job of covering a really wide range of customer journeys and people's financial needs. So I'm saying that my first answer to your question is, I think that fintech will continue to be broad in its scope of what its the trends are, right? So what it's focusing on and what different new ones are. I will say this, and this is how I answered it at the conference as well. There are two areas of financial services that I think are undervalued at this time by both big providers and fintech. And you'll have to forgive me, they overlap a little. One is life events. We know from our research that for more than 20 years, this has been true, and we see no reason to think that it'll change in the foreseeable future. The number one driver of financial product purchasing of any kind and from any kind of company are life events. And those tend to be the big demographic shifts, marital shifts, career shifts, right? Getting married, getting engaged, getting divorced, getting separated, having a child, adopting, all of those things. And there's roughly a dozen or so of them that are the main catalysts for people going out and looking for financial products and accounts. And yet, despite that being the primary driver of financial needs, no real bank, almost all of them have life events buried somewhere on their marketing website. And I just think that there's a room, I was talking about realtors, right? If you've ever bought a house, you have a really close relationship with that realtor, even though you only spend 6 months with them, and then that's at the end of their relationship with you. And I wonder if there's some sort of fintech, or multiple probably, that will start to play the role of kind of realtor for financial services, where their role is not what, all financial service companies are built on the idea of being your go-to for 20 plus years, right? That's the whole idea. That's what all of them want to be. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if there are going to be some smart fintechs who say, we don't need to do that. We'll be there for you for while you, during the pregnancy your finances, or during the move, or whatever it is. And I'm not smart enough to come up with that company, but I think that others will start to do that. Number two is a concept Forrester calls shared finances. Yep. And we didn't make up the term, but I'll quickly give you our definition of it, which we did create, which is any situation in which one person acts as an observer of, a partner in, or a proxy for another person's finances. And when I say this to in bank audiences, there's always an old stodgy banker who says something like, oh, you mean joint checking accounts or joint brokerage accounts or credit cards with multiple cardholders. And I say those fall into the broad umbrella of shared finances, but those aren't doing anything close to covering the range, the value, and the complexity of people's interpersonal financial lives. So some examples include, divorced couples who are co-funding a child's education, business owners and partnerships that are relatively new, right? So it's easy to manage finances when it's a father and son running a business, although even that can get complicated, but it's much harder when it's a group of friends. Friends, even small things like friends going on vacation, right? I wrote a blog post about Splitwise, right? Barely even a fintech company, but a little startup that has a little app that makes it easier to manage. You don't want to be nickel and diming and writing down what everyone spends while you're on vacation. And then more sensitive things like, as parents get older, elderly parents, their adult children sort of managing their finances for them. There's a fintech company called Tomorrow that deals with the financial implications of death. And that's a big, dark, I'm sorry to end on this, but there's a lot of need there. And banks and brokerages don't do nothing there. But they have not. I mean, they have left that area pretty open, and as a result, I think it'll be open to disruption. So those are some of the things we think. I will say, I'll go back though to just, I think fintech will keep doing what it's doing, which is really good. Which is just, what is it in Jurassic Park where the Tyrannosaurus Rex is really good at testing all the wires? That's what fintech's doing all the time. Is they'll try something out. Oh no, that doesn't work. All right, we'll try something else out. And that's what the banks have never been good at. And the fintech are really good at, and bots will be a part of that. I have no doubt.
Cool. Well, for all you data scientists out there, tap into the transactional data and start predicting life events. That sounds like an excellent
absolutely
AI. All right, everybody, this has been excellent. Again, we're with Peter Wannemacher from Forrester Research. The session here today was called "Are Bots Ready to Be Bankers?" And I hope you guys enjoyed the content. Peter, thanks so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Have a great day.
Perfect. All right, man, we did it on the first pass. We're
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I should have asked you this before. I didn't know how. I think I went a little long on my answers sometimes. I don't want to give, when I've done interviews, on stages, I always hate when the person sort of answers just like, yes, well, maybe in the next year. And you're like, all right, I don't want to do this. So I tried to answer with a lot of content. I might have gone too far in some cases, in which case, my apologies.
No worries. I went on a little bit off the script here, kind of following on what you were saying. I think this is going to be excellent content. So
I was going to say, I noticed that, but I think that makes perfect sense. I will say, if anyone ever asks you, we wrote that on purpose, that title, and I stand by all I articulated them just now. That said, I am worried. My caution is to the bank executives who are rushing headlong into the bot world. Mm-hmm. I don't want that to end up stifling interest in bots, which we are decidedly bullish on in the long term. The term conversational banking, I am a believer in. So that's something I just, I'm always worried about.
Yeah, I mean, we take a pretty interesting stance on that. We think that, bots as a technology where you're expected to come to the blinking cursor and just know exactly what to say. In our opinion, that's so far away from where we try and get banks to think about where the real value is. We're probably outwardly seen as a bot company, but we literally have 8-to-1 more financial AI happening in our house than we do conversational AI. And the ability for us to throw those financial events and even some of the milestone work that we're doing is pretty interesting. I'd love to get your feedback on that at some point.
Yeah.
We throw them over the fence, and then the conversational engine is just there to be a vehicle and just transfer that value. So it's interesting I think you're spot on there for sure.
Well, yeah, and I'd love to keep talking, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. Let me know how it goes, and happy to talk in the future.
All right, Peter, you and Guns N' Roses, you guys have a great,
I love this.
great Friday night.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Right. Cheers, mate.